All right, well, we have hit 6 o'clock and I just wanted to welcome you all. Happy Sunshine Week. This is our opportunity to think about open government, the ability to follow the money. And tonight we really have this opportunity to learn from folks who were actually at the trial. Now, it's Sunshine Week and it's beyond annoying to me that we didn't have a chance to watch the trial kind of the way that we would have if, for example, the Ohio Supreme Court was having a hearing. When we think about transparency, we're going to talk about dark money, but we should also be thinking about all the different places in government and at the Statehouse, in the courts, where greater transparency could lead to greater accountability. All right. With that, I'm going to encourage you, if you have questions, there is a Q&A area. So just put your question in the Q&A. Some questions we'll try to answer as we go. Others I'm going to save and they'll be asked to panelists later. So welcome. Happy Sunshine Week. And let's get started talking about the householder enterprise, dark money, and how the lack of public scrutiny led to all sorts of nonsense and public corruption. And welcome, everybody. I wanted to say a big thank you to our co-sponsors. You will notice Ohio Citizen Action here, All Voting is Local, ACLU Ohio, Ohio Fair Courts Alliance, Ohio Voice, Ohio Environmental Council, and a big thank you to the League of Women Voters of Ohio. And once again, I'm really glad that you're here. I wanted to start by just taking us a little bit of a step back. So in July of 2020, so it was actually July 21st, 2020, Householder and some of his allies were arrested. Now, since that point, in October of 2020, Jeff Longstra, Juan Cespedes, and this one I always find really interesting, and the nonprofit Generation Now pled guilty. Now, sadly, 2 years, basically to today, Neil Clark ended up leaving us as a result of suicide. And it's incredibly sad to think about this as part of the story here. I'm going to encourage all of you, it's 988. That's that new suicide prevention hotline. And I want to make sure that we share that as much as possible. And then, we think about, well, okay, what then happened next? In July of 2021, what happened is that First Energy basically signed a deferred prosecution agreement. And so we're slowly getting to some accountability. Now, that doesn't mean that we aren't still paying subsidies for coal plants. That was part of House Bill 6. That doesn't mean that we have good renewable energy standards. But this is where we are at this point. And with that, I would like to introduce you to Sandy Theis. Many of you will know her from Progress Ohio. And also, of course, she was a wonderful political reporter, Statehouse reporter and bureau chief for the Plain Dealer. And some of us will remember Dancers for Democracy. So she has had a very interesting career, and it looks like she's walking us through her house. And with that, I'm going to encourage once again, everybody, put your questions in the QA. And also, there are 225 of you, which is very exciting. So put, where you're from, share a little bit of information in the chat. It's much more fun if we have a sense of how many folks are here. So welcome, everybody. And with that, Sandy Theis, you're up.
Thanks, everybody. I had to feed my dog. You probably heard him barking. Thanks, Common Cause, for putting this whole thing together. And thanks all of you who care enough about our state to join us on a lovely evening. Justice Brandeis once said, I was raised on a farm and I know sunshine is the best disinfectant. You don't have to be at the Statehouse for 15 minutes to know that we need a little more sunshine and we need a lot more disinfectant. I'm going to give you the schoolhouse rock, the non-schoolhouse rock version of how the bill really becomes law sometimes, especially in the state of Ohio. And before we talk about what we learned at the trial, a couple things we need to remember. One is this wasn't First Energy's first bailout. It was either its third or its fourth, depending on how you count. The other thing is utilities are regulated in the state of Ohio, and in exchange for providing us with reliable and affordable power, we guarantee them customers and we guarantee them profits. I'm a small business owner. I would love to be guaranteed customers and profits. And even though we give them these guarantees, they continue to come with their hands out and poor mouth under false conditions, and they get the ratepayers to give them stuff that they don't deserve. Those profits are determined, there's the darn dog again, those profits are determined by some by the legislators and mostly by the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. That's a 5-member panel that's appointed by the governor. And what the jurors learned from an incredible investigation by the Justice Department and the FBI was details of this complicated system. They learned a little bit about politics. They learned about fundraising. And they told us that in order to pull off this racketeering scheme, they needed to raise the bribes. They needed to use that money to get Larry Householder elected. I'm going to feed the damn dog again, to get Larry Householder elected speaker, because the speaker's powerful and he controls the flow of legislation and has more say than anybody in what gets on the floor and what passes. And then in anticipation of this being very unpopular, they anticipated this would put before voters and ask them to repeal it. And they also had a plan for that. And it was mean and it was racist, and it succeeded. So to pull off this, you had to have a lot of understanding of politics, of policy, of campaign finance reform, and of utility regulation. And to do that successfully, they needed to hide the money. And they did a masterful job of hiding the money. Larry Householder took the stand in his own defense, which I think was a real mistake. And I was there the day he took the stand in his own defense. And I think I called Catherine on the way home and I said, I'm terrified. He came off as smart and charming and concerned and bipartisan. And he's a good old boy and he's a good politician. And at one point they asked him about the money that he raised from organized labor. And he said, well, it just wouldn't be a weekend poker game in Perry County if it wasn't for my friends in organized labor. So they bent over backwards to make this bipartisan. Well, then the next day, Emily Glatfelter, who was the lead prosecutor, why did I get a dog? He's very handsome. If you could see him, you would know that. Emily did something that I thought was brilliant. She showed Larry to be a liar. She had him repeat his testimony from the day before, and then she presented him with evidence that showed he was lying. And one of the things that she did was she asked him to repeat his insistence that he doesn't like partisan politics, it's too divisive, and that we need, for the sake of Ohio, to all work together and make Ohio a better place. And then she played an audio tape, a wiretap of he and Neil Clark, and Neil was an energy lobbyist. And Neil talks about how he and Larry talk about how they're going to go to war. They want to go to war. They like war. And at one point, they talk about legislators who didn't vote the way Larry wanted. And he says, well, we're going to fuck with you and we're going to fuck with your kids. They weren't talking about a legislator's children. They were talking about the Republican who dared to challenge Larry for the speaker's job. And the kids were the other people who were on the team of Larry's rivals. There were times when I felt like I was watching The Sopranos. It was profane. It was violent. They were threatening people who crossed them. And it was really powerful stuff. And I think jurors don't like it when you lie to them. And Larry got caught in a mountain of lies. Some of the best testimony against Matt Borges, who was the co-defendant, who was also found guilty, came from a young man named Tyler Furman. And Tyler was one of the people who was working on the ballot issue to repeal this. And Tyler came off as a nice, somewhat naive person. He insisted Matt Borges was his friend and his mentor. He talked about their past relationships. And at one point, Matt Borges is on tape saying, hey, if I get a call from Randy Ludlow, who's another reporter, I'm going to blow up your house. And you could tell that Tyler Furman was concerned about that, genuinely concerned about that. And he was asked about that. But Laura Bischoff's name was used in vain a couple of times too. And these guys are afraid of sunlight and transparency, and they're afraid of the press. And some of the more complex and sophisticated reporting that I've ever seen at the Statehouse came from people like Laura and Kathiann and Randy Ludlow and some of the other journalists who covered this trial. So thank you guys for what you do. I did not know how it was going to come out. I predicted to a friend of mine that Larry was 70-30 and Borges was 60-40. And thanks to the Justice Department taking an interest in what they say is the biggest political corruption scandal in America, I think we might get ourselves some justice. So, Catherine, I'm going to turn it over to you. Hello, Catherine. Are you going to?
Sorry. So I was going to say, so I would like to introduce you all to Kathiann Kowalski. Now, she has many different hats that she wears. She is a long-term utilities and energy reporter. So sometimes we'll see her stuff in Ione, Ohio, and Energy, Ohio. And one of the things that I spend a lot of time talking about is dark money. But Kathiann is going to walk us through dark money and also give us, a sense of, how this played into the household or enterprise, how dark money was used to essentially hide behind that curtain so that there wasn't the kind of public scrutiny. And one of the things I think is most interesting is how were reporters piecing things together, and how much work did the FBI have to do to actually get the kind of information so that we could hold Larry Householder and Matt Borges accountable. And with that, Kathiann Kowalski.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm glad to be here and really happy to talk with everyone. We're going to go quickly through some slides for a very brief introduction to what dark money is. So, campaign finance laws generally impose limits on how candidates can raise money, how much people can give, and what must be disclosed to the public. And the whole idea there is if you know who's backing a candidate, then you as someone who wants to be an informed voter can make your decision based on, the associations, right? So next slide. That's how it should work. Dark money, though, is about funds that influence the political process, whose origins can't be traced. And that comes about as a result of a 2010 decision by the Supreme Court called Citizens United. And the whole concept there behind Citizens United is these are separate corporations. So we see our candidate nesting doll is looking one way, and the Santa Claus nesting doll, the dark money group, is looking another way, and they're not having anything to do with each other. Next slide. However, because the donors aren't disclosed, what you would see as a member of the public is perhaps you're watching TV and you see a whole bunch of ads that might say, sponsored by Generation Now, sponsored by Hardworking Ohioans, sponsored by some other group, right? So these would be different organizations. Next slide. But if you could look inside the workings of any one of those dark money groups, you might be surprised at the characters that you find backing them. Okay, next slide. So you can have like one corporation giving money to another, giving money to another, giving money to another, who finally funnels it into a dark money group. And you can also find some dark money groups funneling then money to other dark money groups, right? Adding yet another layer of complexity to make it harder to trace. Now, the Internal Revenue Service does not require a disclosure of who the donors are. They do require some disclosures about what grants groups are making in their annual filings. In other words, how are they spending their money? So when I and other reporters looked to try to piece some of this together, we used some of those annual filings to get information, but the information would come out maybe 2 or more years later. One example is that it was, I think, December 2019 before I was finally able to get a copy of Generation Now's annual Form 990 report for the year 2017. And that's the first year it existed. You know, we'd already had the 2018 elections, but you weren't even going to get the 2018 numbers until late 2020, if you were lucky. And they wound up never even filing those. So next slide. So the result of that is, you know, you then have the layer in the householder Borges case of not only was this money hard to trace, but behind the scenes, our candidate, Larry Householder, was, you know, according to testimony in the trial that I heard and others heard, very palsy-walsy with Generation Now and some of the other dark money groups involved in this. So it was not a matter of really independent spending. And next slide. So the result is when I went and looked, Larry Householder's name is not showing up on anything public having to do with Generation Now. We found some information for Generation Now, some for some other groups. We identified various players. Matt Borges did show up. Juan Cespedes did show up from his lobbying firm. But again, I could only trace about $3 million. And as we saw from the first slide, this case involved about $60 million. So I'm done with the slides. So that brings us to what was it like in the trial? And I was down there for 6 full days of the trial. And you know, what I saw first is we were getting a lot of information. A lot of it was this rather, you know, jarring material that Sandy talked about, but the tone in the courtroom was very professional, right? This was not like an old episode of Perry Mason or something like that. So people were, you know, the lawyers were not raising their voices. The witnesses, by and large, were pretty clear. Blaine Wetzel, the state's star witness, would, you know, look at Emily Gladfelter when she was questioning him, and then turn to the jury to explain and give his answer. The government did an amazing job laying out the case in a way that connected the dots. So, for example, during the case in chief, you would see, you know, Blaine Wetzel explaining, you know, here are materials that show communications between some of the people at First Energy and some of the lobbyists or Householder or people in Generation Now or whatever, right? So they would have the communications. Then they would show, you know, sometimes organizations were set up not long after those communications. Or they would show, you know, once the organization is set up, here's the money balance that this organization had before money went into it. Here's money going into the organization soon after those communications. Here's transfers out, right? So they did this really amazing job of letting you follow the money. And the cross-examination was extremely effective. As Sandy noted, it not only caught inconsistencies, it got some recanting, but it also built on the government's case. So I should mention here, I also have practiced law for 15 years, and I'm still licensed as an attorney in Ohio. So I was watching this both as a reporter and as a lawyer, and you know, the government lawyers not only destroyed any brownie points that the defense might have been getting, but they did a good job of taking things the defense said and adding extra bricks to the wall they were building to shore up their own case. So that was amazing. What can Ohio do now, right? We're waiting for post-trial motions. There's likely to be appeals after sentencing. You know, some Supreme Court cases limit what can be done about dark money reporting, but they don't say you can't do anything. So one idea perhaps might be more frequent audits, which perhaps the Ohio Attorney General might do. There's also steps that the Public Utilities Commission could take, because, you know, if they're giving these benefits to a utility, then arguably they have a right to demand more information from the utility and from the parent corporation or affiliates who may be influencing what actions the utility takes and how it's managed. The case also, I should note, you know, most of us on the call are from Ohio, but this case has national implications. This not only for utility cases, because there has been corruption in other states as well, but also because the question fundamentally is, what information should voters be able to have, and what limits should there be on what corporations can do to hide the backing that they're giving? So with that, I think I stayed within my time, and I'm going to turn it back to Catherine. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. So now I would like to introduce you to Laura Bischoff. Now, Laura Bischoff has the distinction of actually being mentioned during the trial while she was at the trial. So many of you remember her from the Dayton Daily newspaper for many years. She is now with Gannett. And so that's, you know, like the Columbus Dispatch and the Akron Beacon Journal and Cincinnati Enquirer and a bunch of other newspapers. We're just really pleased that Laura is here, and I'm just going to hand it off to you, Laura.
Unmute. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, so I was able to cover the trial all 7 weeks from gavel to gavel with my colleague, Jesse Balmert. You know, there are no cameras or recorders allowed in federal court. So really, we thought it was our duty to be the eyes and the ears of the public. And it was interesting, the trial started out, I think Larry Householder had a lot of confidence. He arrived holding hands with his wife, and actually held like a press gaggle on the courtroom floor before court got underway. And the first day, it was almost like he had never really even put down the gavel, the speaker's gavel. Now, this was a hard case, I think, for the Department of Justice to make that connection that bribe money crossed a legal line. That dark money crossed a legal line and became a bribe. The Department of Justice introduced, I think, almost 900 exhibits into evidence. But I think that the key turning points in the trial came when Juan Cespedes and Jeff Longstreth, who were co-conspirators and signed guilty pleas in October of 2020, when they got on the stand and kind of helped bolster some of the documents that the FBI agent had introduced. A lot of the bank records and meetings and text messages. Juan and Jeff helped explain why those things were said or the context of those meetings. And I think that was like kind of a big turning point. I think the case really hinged on, they also got some other big breaks in the case. One is that Neil Clark was caught up in an earlier public corruption investigation having to do with Cincinnati City Council members. And the FBI ran a sting with some undercovers posing as real estate developers. And they hired him as their lobbyist for sports betting. And on the tapes, Neil, who died by suicide 2 years ago today, he was very boastful and talked a lot about the House Bill 6 happenings, because it was all kind of at the same time. And then another big break for the feds on this case was that Tyler Furman was willing to go to the FBI after Matt Borges approached him about buying insider information on the referendum attempt, and he wore a wire against Borges. I think Sandy mentioned it, that Larry Householder took the stand, and it was kind of a bright moment for him. in that it was his opportunity to tell his story and to kind of turn on his politician charm. He's a very skilled communicator. He spent an entire career convincing people to, vote for his bills and come to his side and his thinking on things. But then when the next day on cross-examination was pretty devastating, Emily Gladfelter is a very skilled federal prosecutor, and she just basically dismantled his claims one by one and led him into different traps. The case overall, I would say, really pulled back the curtain on what's going on behind the scenes with all this dark money. And this case was extremely egregious, and that's why it made it into federal court. They used some public records, but then, the power of subpoena was really on display because they were able to get bank records, text messages, emails. Also, that deferred prosecution agreement that was signed by First Energy in July of 2021 was really crucial because they were able to get First Energy to fork over a lot of the records that they didn't want to be seen. A common theme in this case was that it was secrecy. They didn't want the public to know. They didn't want the press to know. They certainly didn't want me or Randy Ludlow to know what was going on. Some people might feel discouraged and think like, well, what kind of impact will this have, or has it had? And already the case has had a big impact. I mean, you have Larry Householder and Matt Borges convicted. You got two other guys who pleaded guilty, Longstreth and Cespedes. You have the deferred prosecution agreement and almost a complete turnover on the board of directors at First Energy, as well as new executive staff there. And House Bill 6 was partially unraveled, although there's still the coal subsidies in place. And I think the last thing I kind of wanted to point out is, I like to say that the antidote to public corruption is having informed citizens such as yourselves who are, if you're dialing into a webinar on a Wednesday night about Sunshine Week, then I suspect that you are informed citizens. But I would just say that reading the newspaper and subscribing to the newspaper is super important. And if you don't already subscribe, please do so.
Well, thank you so much. Now, I know there are lots of questions. We're taking them, and once we get through panelists, we'll be asking a lot of the questions. So the next batter up is actually Sandy Theis to talk about the Legislative Service Commission. So many of you will be familiar with this agency. Essentially, what they do is they do the bill writing, and they help with research. And with that, Sandy, can you tell us a little bit about kind of the transparency through the legislative process, which is another piece of this puzzle?
Sure. The Legislative Service Commission is sort of like the nerd farm at the General Assembly. They put you through training. They have a very good internship program. So if you are a college student and you're looking to get involved in politics, check out the LSC internship program. They write the bills. They also do something called a fiscal note, and that is where their analysts look at the impact of legislation on customers, voters, businesses, taxpayers. And about 20 years ago, the LSC records were closed in response to a previous utility pay-to-play scandal involving the same utility and just lesser amounts of money. Roy Ray was the Senate Finance Committee chairman from Akron, and the Finance Committee chair is the most powerful position other than the Senate president and the Speaker of the House. They do the state budget, and that's where we decide how to spend billions of dollars. So usually it's a senior person with a lot of clout. Roy Ray was that senior person with a lot of clout. And there were some weird federal records. I think they might have been federal energy regulatory records that showed that a consulting firm owned by Roy Ray had gotten $161,000. Of course, the bribes were a lot smaller back then, from Ohio Edison, which is now part of First Energy. And then he introduced a bill to once again subsidize the nuclear power plants that would have put a lot of money in Ohio Edison's pockets. Well, the Senate Democrats filed a public records request with the Legislative Service Commission, and they learned that Roy Ray, even though he put his name on that bill, didn't really write it. the utility that had him on their payroll wrote it. And that became a big scandal. And I was a reporter back then. I was with the Cincinnati Enquirer, so I was in Southwest Ohio and the scandal was in Northeast Ohio. But I remember the Senate president signaling to Roy Ray that he had to get off the Senate floor because he didn't want him to vote on that bill. You would think that a serious reform would have come out of that. The only thing they did was they closed the LSC records to the public. And as a result of it, the price of the bribes went from 161,000 to 60 million, and we started using dark money. So the price of the bribes went up and they made it harder to hide the bribes. One of the things that Common Cause wants to do is they want to reopen those LSC records, and they want to name them after a reporter named Jim Siegel, who was really, really good. He, at the time of his very early and surprise death, he was with the Columbus Dispatch, and he had a way of getting information that most normal mortals couldn't. And I'm quite frankly surprised that nobody has championed that reform. These are our records. The public pays for the salaries and the benefits of everybody who's working for the Legislative Service Commission. We pay for the electricity and the other utilities in the offices that they occupy, and we pay for them to produce these records. These are our records, and they're really, really important ones. And anybody listening, please help us get those things reopened. It would really be a public service. Back to you, Catherine.
All right, well, thank you, Sandy. So at this point, we're going to hear from Dave Davis. So many of the folks that are on this call, I met nearly 20 years ago, and that also goes for Dave. So he is a former plain dealer reporter. He also was previously the journalism fellow at Youngstown State University. He wrote a really interesting book that I encourage you all to check out called Plain Dealing: Cleveland Journalists Tell Their Stories. And with that, Dave, I'm just going to hand it to you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Catherine. It's great to be taking part in this important event. You know, in preparing for this webinar, I've been thinking a lot about two big questions. What is the state of the sunshine laws in Ohio today? And would stronger laws and reporting requirements have prevented this $60 million criminal scheme and the damage done by House Bill 6? And what's the damage? The reporting this week shows or says that it's going to cost Ohio consumers about $150 million a year. And there are other costs as well. I think they're very hard to pinpoint. And you know, this number may be a bit hard to pinpoint. For example, Pennsylvania consumers paid $2.4 million in inappropriate costs related to the Ohio criminal investigation, according to reporting by Energy and Policy Institute. Pennsylvania consumers paid for Ohio in this scandal. While I don't have a way to absolutely quantify this, my observations and recent experience lead me to say that transparency in Ohio is on the ropes, I think. That's my personal opinion. And overall, it is more difficult than ever to get public records, with some exceptions. There's still some victories out there. And I think this is especially important when we talk about campaign finance. Citizens United really turned that world upside down and has made a lot of reporting, and it's very difficult, as we've heard from Kathiann and Laura. But I'd like to hear what you all think too. I know for sure that this case, in my opinion, is a call to action. We just heard it from Sandy, and I'm going to try not to go over this territory again, but we really need to see the work of the Legislative Services Commission. That would allow us to see how bills like House Bill 6 are written and influenced. That's so important. I think that's a cause that people need to take up. As Sandy said, and Kathiann and Laura too, this information belongs to the public. It belongs to us. And I just wanted to add that I've been at this a while, longer than I think I want to say now. Sandy and I used to work together a while back. And, this was never easy. Getting records was never easy. The people who had them often, really always, tried to keep us from getting them, or at least they tried to slow down giving them to us so that, maybe it would go away. Over the years, I've been involved in hundreds of fights. For example, I used records obtained under the Ohio Records Act to expose the worst radiation accident ever in medicine. That was when 28 patients died from radiation exposure at Riverside Methodist Hospital there in Columbus. I thought we made a good case. The tragedy had never been disclosed, and I thought we made a good case that it had actually been covered up by state officials and by federal officials. And we did, and we were able to do all this through dozens of public record requests. The families involved in that tragedy actually they never knew what happened for sure. They had been left all these years upset, feeling alone and angry. Never, it had never really been explained to them. Public records also introduced me to scores of families needing life-saving organ transplants who were waiting at hospitals unknown to them that were frequently turning away donor organs for non-medical reasons. We found patients who were told they would die within 6 months at transplant centers where the wait was measured in years. Patients like Teddy DeWalt, a firefighter who died while enduring months of poking and prodding with the hope of getting a new heart, a second chance at life. His wife never left his side, and yet they didn't know that every offer that came in for Teddy was turned away because the program had actually been shut down temporarily, and it wouldn't reopen in time for him.
Oh, God.
So the DeWalts didn't know what happened, and patients didn't know how long transplant time. The wait at transplant centers varies dramatically by the center, but that had never been publicly disclosed. So we got the records these were under the Federal Freedom of Information Act. And for the first time, we published the waiting times and mortality rates for every transplant center in the nation, and gave people that information. And in 2002, working with Sandy and Julie Carr-Smythe at the Plain Dealer, we found that roughly 2/3 of the $4 million then State Treasurer Joe Dieters had raised for his reelection war chest had come from people with business ties to the Treasury. So this has always this has always been happening. Included in the money we also found that Dieter's staff had directed bankers and brokers who did business with them to give to the Hamilton County GOP, where he had been the party chairman. His campaign, in return, received almost dollar for dollar what the bankers and brokers had given to Hamilton County. Included in the money routed from Hamilton County was a $50,000 donation from disgraced broker Frank Brudidaria, who had pleaded guilty that year to bilking clients out of hundreds of millions of dollars while managing the Cleveland offices of Lehman Brothers and S.G. Cowan. Those firms and Gruttadaria did a combined business with the state, with Joe Dieters, of $5.9 billion in a 2-year period just before that.
Well, that's a good time to bring up some questions for you guys, because
You sure
Matt-
you want to do that? Okay.
yeah, I do. Matt Borges, one of the people who got in trouble from that plain dealer investigation that we did, was the same Matt Borges convicted with Larry Householder.
Yes, yes,
It was the same thing, hiding the money,
yes.
pay to play, something of value for government services. And Matt Borges got off with a slap on the wrist. It was a misdemeanor. He pleaded guilty, got his record expunged, and then he got
Yes.
promoted. And one of my pet peeves is when there are no consequences, people continue to misbehave. Larry Householder got in trouble before, Matt Borges got in trouble before, and here they are now in trouble still. So I've got some technical questions, if I may. Kathiann, you were on a dark money panel at the Columbus Metropolitan Club. Dave DeVillers was on it with you, the U.S. attorney, when this case was filed. And there was the deferred prosecution agreement that First Energy signed was mentioned. In that agreement, they admitted that they bribed the head of the PUCO, Sam Randazzo. Sam was a utility lawyer. He was always living on the margins for a very long time. And somebody in the audience during the Q&A section said, how can First Energy say, oh, we bribed Sam? And how can the guy he bribed not have gotten in any trouble? And Dave DeVillers said, this investigation is ongoing. Do you think Sam is eventually going to get indicted? And can you tell us why you believe that to be the case or not to be the case? Who's next?
There are a variety of possible targets for criminal charges. Sam Randazzo's name has been mentioned, even though he's denied liability. The two First Energy executives who were identified in a shareholder suit as in response to who paid the bribes, Chuck Jones and Mike Dowling, also are potentially targets. And, you know, I believe they also have denied liability. There are, you know, a variety of other Energy Harbor executives that we heard about in trial, various lobbyists that we heard about during the trial. There were at least two instances, well, in one instance, someone who would have testified for the defense took the Fifth Amendment and said he did not want to testify. Somebody else.
He was from Energy Harbor, wasn't he? The guy who took the Fifth?
No, the guy who took the Fifth was somebody who had been working with a law firm.
It was Jeff Verhoff of Aiken Gump.
Oh,
Correct.
that's right.
Right,
That's right.
he was
That's a
with a
big
law
law
firm.
firm. Okay.
And another witness who had been a lobbyist involved in the matter was asked by Judge Black before he let him take the stand, are you aware of your First Amendment rights? Has your lawyer advised you of those? To make sure that he was testifying with knowledge of those. One of the things that was told to me when I talked with Vipal Patel some months ago, when I said, why aren't we seeing these other cases yet? He noted that one of the things federal prosecutors want to do is make sure they've got their ducks in a row. And so part of that may be a matter of people trying to make sure that they have all the evidence lined up. They may be able to get some leverage to get a couple of more people to talk now that the householder verdicts are in. But that's one concern, is you want to make sure you've got everything ready so you're not surprised and you're pretty sure you can win. The other factor that he mentioned to me is that even though we think of the federal government as this giant monolith, there are only a certain number of people involved in the criminal division at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District. And they are not just working on First Energy and the myriad entangled web of House Bill 6, but they are also dealing with, there was a big case where there was, a Chinese spy, and there were other corporate matters that come up that they look into. And so sometimes it's a matter of having the priority there.
Okay. Laura, I've got a question for you. I keep hearing from friends of mine that I know we just learned the extent of this and we now have these guilty verdicts, but for a long time, we've known that something strange was happening and something wrong was happening. But everybody who was on Larry Householder's team got reelected. There was a Republican House member, the only one who did not get reelected, did not vote for House Bill 6. His name was David Greenspan. And Mike DeWine handily won reelection, even though he appointed the PUCO chair, who First Energy has said, oh, by the way, we bribed, even though he quickly signed the bailout bill into law, and even though he stacked his inner circle with First Energy loyalists. So what do you make of this? Does the public not care about corruption? Was it too complicated? Why do you think the people who brought us this mess all seem to do very well at the polls?
Well, Dave Greenspan was the Republican lawmaker who actually called the FBI and got the case started in May of 2019. And he was in a very competitive district, and he knew that if he went against Householder, it was very likely that the caucus would withhold funds from him. And so, I mean, he decided to do that, even though he knew that it would likely lead to his election loss in the election. As far as, why Mike DeWine won, even though, there are these, even though he signed House Bill 6, Mike DeWine has been in Ohio politics since the 1970s. He's extremely well known. He's got incredible name ID. I think a lot of voters gave him credit for how he handled the coronavirus pandemic, at least from the outset. And I think that was too much to overcome by Nan Whaley in that race.
Dave, I got a question for you. You mentioned this Joe Dieter's project that we did many, many years ago. He's now on the Ohio Supreme Court, by the way. And our former newspaper has editorialized against that. I went back and I read those old clips. And the one thing that Dieter said was, I never said to the Hamilton County Republican Party, if I gave you that money, you have to give me this money back.
Yeah.
And during the trial, we heard from Larry Householder and Matt Borges and their lawyers. We never said, if you give us this money, we'll give you this ballot. We never said that. But they ended up both being convicted. Why do you think that was the case? And what sort of records did you use to make the case that this was a quid pro quo? We brought Dave in because he can find money that other normal mortals can't. So that's why we borrowed him from the home office in Cleveland.
Yeah, Joe Dieter's, that was what he said. In fact, he said that donors just understood that they might give to the Hamilton County Party because that was a good place to put their money. They were just interested in politics, and that was a good place to park their money. It's interesting because they claim there wasn't a dollar for dollar exchange, but I looked up the numbers, and actually in the contributions to the Hamilton County Party, GOP, totaled $304,000 in 2021. And the checks that the Hamilton County GOP cut to Joe Dieter's were just about, not even $1,000 less, $303,000. So that sort of made the argument. And then later, Dieters did admit that they were directing people to Hamilton County, but he still said, oh, Hamilton County's not doing anything. We didn't have an agreement with them that they would support us.
Laura and Kathiann, do you think it's become easier, harder, or no change in getting public records that you request in the last 5-10 years?
There's certainly more delay.
I know when
And-
I ask for them now, I always get back, my request is overly broad. And I didn't know whether that was just, I don't have a newspaper behind me anymore backing me up, or whether it's just harder. What about you, Laura? Easier, harder, the same?
I would say it's about the same. I think that, you know, a lot of records are held electronically now, and so they're a lot easier to produce by the government when they want to. There are certainly still games being played, though, in terms of, you know, you ask for records and they say, I got your, we acknowledge your request. And then, you know, months later, they say it's overly broad, or they respond and they bury you in paper, or, you know, they hide the ball. Like, there's all kinds of little games. But in general, you know, I think that the open records law is really pretty powerful, and we're glad to have it. Although it does seem that it's the exemption list has grown exponentially since I started covering the legislature 20 years ago.
Right. And I should also mention there are purges that take place from what you can publicly get without a public records request. So for various bills at the end of the session, you have things knocked out so that the comments no longer automatically show up there, right? And for, you know, I tried last year, I asked for, please give me all the comments that were filed and the testimony on the particular bill that sent, you know, opened Ohio to fracking, Senate Bill 315 in 2012. And I was told, oh, you got to drive down to Columbus and go to the Ohio Center and look at them there.
I know during the trial, we learned how they went to great lengths to not create public records. Juan Cespedes said that he personally walked copies of different versions of House Bill 6 from place to place rather than email them to not create a public record. What kind of stuff did we learn during the trial about all their efforts to hide the ball?
You know, it's interesting. Larry Householder was on cross-examination. It came out that, you know, he deletes his text messages very regularly, regardless of whatever kind of retention schedule he may have been under as a state lawmaker. And he said that he did that because he's super frugal and he didn't want to pay for storage fees each month. However, he was willing to pay for tickets, he says, multiple sets of tickets to World Series games in Cleveland in 2016. He insisted that he paid for those tickets, which Emily Gladfelter pointed out were on average $2,500 per ticket.
Catherine, you want to hit up the questions in the chat?
So, you know, one of the things that, you know, folks are wondering about, you know, clearly they're interested in, like, you know, what's up with Sam Randazzo, and how does this whole thing come together? And also, when are folks going to be carted off? So, like, you know, one of the things that if Laura can tell us a little bit about you know, how long it is between the trial and, you know, and the actual sentencing.
So in the federal system, if you're out on bond pre-trial and you didn't have any issues and you're out awaiting sentencing, you're not taken into custody right away unless there's a indication that you're likely to flee or harm the public. And so these Borges and Householder were released on bond, and the next step is for the pre-sentencing report to be done. That usually takes about 90 days. And then the judge would probably schedule sentencing about a month or so after that. Each party, Householder and Borges, can file memos, you know, adding or subtracting to the pre-sentencing report, etc. So there's a little bit of a dance there. And then I think, so I think the sentencing should happen sometime this summer.
Matt Borges, when he got in trouble the first time with the Dieter stuff, he insisted it was politically motivated, that the prosecutor who prosecuted him was a Democrat and just wanted to run for attorney general, and his boss, Joe Dieters, also wanted to run for attorney general. This time, Matt Borges said his prosecution was politically motivated because the Trump Justice Department went after him because he worked for John Kasich's presidential race. Is that going to have any impact at all on his sentencing, or the fact that he's a two-time offender and he whines about people who went headhunting?
I don't think that an expunged misdemeanor conviction would necessarily be calculated into it. I think the fact that they went to trial and they did not accept responsibility means they won't get acceptance points when it comes to like the federal sentencing guidelines. And that means, you know, if you accept responsibility, you can kind of chisel the potential sentence down. I must say that both Householder and Borges said on the courthouse steps that they plan on appealing their convictions. And, you know, I don't know what their grounds for appeal might be. I know that Householder's attorneys twice said that they felt that Judge Black was biased against them, in part because Judge Black ran for Ohio Supreme Court against Deborah Cook in 2000, and Larry Householder raised some dark money to benefit Cook at the time. So that was one of the allegations. And then there was sort of a standing opposition by both the Householder and Borges defense teams against using the Neil Clark tapes because you know, they didn't, he was already passed away, and they didn't have an opportunity to cross-examine him or confront him.
So
I
one of
mean-
the things that's happening in the chat is people have lots of questions kind of about kind of the governor and the lieutenant governor. And I realize we're getting very close to wrapping up, but I wondered if anybody wanted to add, you know, anything about kind of the governor's, lieutenant governor's connection to the Householder enterprise in this House Bill 6 scandal.
Yeah, when the trial was going on, right, like as a journalist, I'm sitting there and in the courtroom and looking at where they're projecting the exhibits, and you know, DeWine's name came up, Husted's name came up. We also saw at one point, you know, now Congressman Mike Carey's name came up, and I kept wanting to sit there and say, wait, can we go back a slide? Can I look at that again? Can I get that more? Because the prosecution was focused only on these defendants, they were not going into it. But there are a lot of questions that have not been asked. You know, I think it was Laura or Jesse in one story when they had written about this December 8, 2018 dinner with Husted, DeWine, Jones, and Dowling. And, you know, they asked and the comment came back, well, we can't remember what it was. Like, they've never said what happened there. And when I asked them, they were like, we've already laid this to rest. No, you haven't laid it to rest. So there are lots of questions that remain.
Laura, you did a story on how much money DeWine got from First Energy, correct?
Yeah, when I was at the Dayton Daily News, I kind of calculated all the different places in which that came through hard dollars, and then also through what we could find in terms of dark money contributions dark money contributions essentially, because, you know, Governor DeWine had got support from the Republican Governors Association. First Energy Solutions gave $500,000 in October of 2018 to the RGA. And that's like disclosed money. I don't know if they gave other money to the RGA's State Solutions Dark Money Group or not, but in total, it came up to like $1 million.
And we know that John Husted has a long-standing relationship with Sam Randazzo, and he and DeWine's chief of staff, Laurel Dawson, whose husband, Mike Dawson, either is or was a consultant for both First Energy and the coal barons, the Boych companies who gave to the dark money group. They recruited Sam to be the head of the PUCO. What else did we learn about the governor and the lieutenant governor involvement in this during the trial that we didn't already know?
Well, I mean, the governor signed the bill. John Husted pushed, like, kind of lobbied behind the scenes to add more years to the subsidy that came out in text messages. You know, both DeWine and Husted maintained that they, you know, they supported nuclear power. They supported an Ohio-based company, and that's why they went to bat. And we, you know, we don't know more because it didn't really come out in the trial.
And actually,
If there is more, you
in the
know,
legislature or from DeWine or Husted, anybody saying, show us that you need the money and show us how that, you know, show us that if we give you the money, you're going to manage this properly. Nobody asked those questions in the legislature. The most we saw was one email from DeWine to Randazzo at one point that said, hey, Sam, do they need the money?
And he sent that on his private, from his private email, which is still a public record, but I
right.
thought that was interesting.
And the response was somewhat incomprehensible, but did not actually provide financial information.
Those nuclear plants that they kept saying, we need the subsidy or they will go belly up and we will lose all these jobs, they've just been sold.
$3.4 billion.
Does that tell us that that whole rationale was baloney?
It raises questions.
well, what was interesting is that in Cespedes' testimony, he was a lobbyist for First Energy Solutions, which, you know, owns the plants, was kind of spun off, went through bankruptcy, emerged with this name Energy Harbor. And it's run by this guy, John Kiani, who's like this very brash and aggressive communicator, according to the testimony and the text messages that we saw. And something that was really surprising to me that came out during the trials, that Cespedes said that Kiani intended on getting the subsidy. He was hell-bent on getting the subsidy. And then he was going to operate the plants briefly and then sell them and personally make $100 million.
And didn't Juan raise his fee in the middle?
No, Juan didn't raise his fee. He was negotiating with First Energy because First Energy Solutions, because Kiani knew that if he, you know, got the subsidy and then turned around and sold the plants, that was not going to go over well in Columbus at the General Assembly. And so he wanted to engage Juan to, like, I don't know, for like $1 million or $2 million or $3 million to kind of smooth things over when that news broke.
No money for the nuclear plant, but money for bribes and bonuses.
The other thing that was really interesting also is that, you know, as the referendum, they weren't sure if it was going to make the ballot, if they were going to get enough signatures. And so Householder, according to testimony, Householder had like Plan B all locked and loaded, which was to just pass House Bill 6 2.0, broken up into different pieces, so it would make it even harder to do a referendum. So, you know, they had their plans.
Well, on that note, we've covered a lot of ground. I'm going to just remind everybody that what we're going to do, and Mia, if you're willing to put up the slides. So what we're going to do is, of course, we're going to send you the recording. It's very clear to me that Mia has a beautiful grandbaby. The other thing that's clear to me is that, you know, there are lots and lots of different questions here, and there are lots of possibilities for upcoming webinars, informational sessions, discussions. And so just consider this kind of the beginning and the kickoff. And I was glad that we were able to do this both on Sunshine, during Sunshine Week and the Ides of March, I might add. So before we go, I just wanted to highlight that we should have a vision of open government. You know, one of the things that can get us all down is the sense that this corruption is ongoing, there's nothing we can do, and even when they go to trial, you know, oh, it's this long, laborious process, we can't change anything. Well, we can change things. And so, you know, what we talked a little bit, Sandy talked about the Legislative Service Commission and creating greater transparency there. We could create greater transparency at the Public Utilities Commission And when it comes to campaign finance, so when we think about ethics statements from our legislators and others, we can create greater transparency so that we can create greater accountability. And Mia, if you're willing to go the next slide. Now, I want us all to do this. So one of the things that can happen is that our state reps, our state senators, and the governor don't have a sense that we're paying attention, or they don't know that we really care about this. And one of the ways to make sure that they know that we care about greater transparency is to simply give them a phone call. And a lot of times I give you an action and I say, hey, here's an email to, I'm encouraging all of us to call our state rep, call our state senator, and give Governor DeWine phone calls to let him know and them know how important transparency and open government is. And you don't have to say more than a sentence, say as much as you're comfortable with, but that we are watching and we paid attention to the householder trial and we want good, accountable government. Now, also, Sunshine Week, I wanted to highlight that we really need to support local journalism. When we think about access to information, if you, for example, Laura Bischoff hadn't been able to be there watching every single day, reporting from there with Jesse Belmert and other reporters who spent significant time in Cincinnati trying to show us what was happening in court, we really would have been left in the dark. And I fear for the kind of accountability if we don't have good local journalism. So I highly encourage you. I think Laura wanted to highlight that there's some special subscriber deals. So I encourage you to check those out. The other thing is, we can become much more engaged in kind of open government by attending public hearings and, pick the issue you care the most about. I noticed that Randy Ludlow, who formerly of the Columbus Dispatch, put his email in the chat saying, hey, if you want to do a public records request, he's willing to help. I also wanted to highlight that I'm willing to help. And with that, I wanted to say thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you so much to our co-sponsors of this event. A big thank you to Sandy Theis, a big thank you to Jessica Dickinson, who did a lot of work on this. And Sandy, do you have any final words?
Legislators are afraid of voters, and they're not used to hearing from them. So if you want to call them, you want to call the governor, that would be good. And I used to get stuck listening to these results of newspaper readership surveys. And always one of the best read things in the newspaper was the letters to the editor. I thought it should have been the things that my bureau generated. Write a letter to the editor. Every paper you can email letters to the editor and the name of the paper, and it will tell you what their rules are. Follow their rules. If they have a 250 word limit, keep to 250 words. Try to do it timely. So if you want to write a letter right now that says, I followed your coverage of the householder trial, Ohio needs better transparency laws, I strongly urge legislator, insert name here, to support a bill to reopen these records, to reform the PUCO, and to improve, bring a little sunshine to state government. That stuff is always helpful. And Randy Ludlow, who has probably done thousands of public records requests, same thing with Catherine, they're volunteering to help. Take them up on those offers.
Well, once again, a big thank you to you all. Any final words, Laura Bischoff?
Happy Sunshine Week.
Any final words, Dave Davis?
No, great session. I learned a lot.
And now we're on to you, Kathiann. Any final words before we end the day? And it's still sunny outside. Did you notice?
I know, it's great. I want to thank everybody for participating and everybody for reading. In addition to local news, I want to put a plug in for nonprofit news, which Energy News Network and Ion Ohio are both free. And we also have a roundup service with digest. So, make sure you read and get your news from multiple sources. Follow issues, and yes, I echo speaking out, because that's the only way change is going to happen. And be critical. Don't take everything at face value. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. Happy Sunshine Week. And we'll see you again at the next webinar. Thank you all, everybody.